For years, people believed that Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip shared everything: life, love, and even their daily routines. But now, that belief has been shaken. Something deeper was always there, just out of view. And the truth didn't come from rumors, reporters, or royal insiders. It came from their own daughter, Princess Anne. In a quiet but powerful moment, she finally spoke about the real reason her father chose to live away from the Queen during the final years of his life. Her words didn't carry drama. They carried honesty. And they changed everything we thought we knew. She said, it wasn't about leaving her, it was about respecting her and himself. Just like that, years of guessing and gossip collapsed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a secret fight. It was something else, something far more human. People used to think they knew the answer. Some said he was tired of royal life. Others whispered about personal regrets or quiet disagreements. But Anne's voice cut through all that noise. She didn't speak as a royal. She spoke as a daughter who had spent a lifetime watching her parents up close. And what she saw wasn't distance, it was love, expressed in a way most people wouldn't expect. She described her father as a man who gave up so much: his name, his career, even parts of his identity, to stand beside the Queen. He walked a step behind her, not just in public, but in the structure of royal life. And he never asked for credit. He didn't complain. He just kept going. For decades. But time catches up with everyone. And for Prince Philip, the need for peace, for quiet, and for a life outside the palace became something he could no longer ignore. He didn't leave in frustration. He stepped away with grace. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he had spent a lifetime proving that he did. Anne made something else clear, too. Her parents never saw this choice as a problem. It was a decision made with care. They understood each other. They respected what the other needed. The Queen had her world of duty. Philip had his need for calm. And somehow, they made space for both. This wasn't a broken marriage. It was a strong one. Strong enough to stretch without snapping. And for those who truly watched them over the years, the signs were always there, not in what they said, but in what they chose to protect. So now, people are asking new questions. What kind of man chooses silence over spotlight? What kind of love allows room to step away without stepping out? And who really was the man behind the Queen? To understand that, we have to look at the boy who was born in exile, raised through loss, and shaped by the storms that would teach him how to hold steady, even when the whole world was watching. Prince Philip was a boy caught in the middle of chaos. His life didn't begin with privilege. It began with exile. Born into both Greek and Danish royalty, Philip was surrounded by titles that meant nothing the moment his family was forced to flee. Political unrest swept through Greece like a storm, and Philip, still a baby, was carried out of the country in a makeshift crib made from an orange box. That image, though simple, held the tone for the rest of his early life: survival over ceremony. The family found shelter in France, not in a palace, but in a borrowed home, thanks to relatives who still had standing. There was no royal fanfare, no sense of permanence, just silence, shadows, and the pressure of pretending everything was fine. His parents did what they could, but life wasn't gentle. His father distanced himself from the family, moving to Monte Carlo, chasing distraction instead of responsibility. His mother, overwhelmed by a mix of loss and mental illness, was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sent away to an asylum. In just a few short years, Philip was left without parents, without a country, and without a home to truly call his own. But this isn't where his story falters. This is where it begins to take shape. He moved again, this time to the United Kingdom, to live with relatives who were more stable, but still not his own. It wasn't warmth he found, it was structure. He was enrolled in different schools across Europe, each one more demanding than the last. And while most children his age were still learning who they were, Philip was learning how to survive. Germany, France, Scotland. The names changed, but the lesson stayed the same. Rely on no one. Keep your head up and never stop moving forward. His time at Gordontown in Scotland was the turning point. It was tough, unforgiving, and exactly what he needed. The school's philosophy wasn't about comfort. It was about strength. Physical tests, icy morning showers, strict routines. It was all designed to break weakness. But Philip didn't break. He hardened, sharpened, and came out the other side with a deep sense of duty and a fierce independence that would never leave him. He didn't have a soft place to land, so he built one inside himself. And through it all, he never complained. That was Philip's code. Life hadn't been kind, but he refused to let bitterness define him. The pain, the silence, the loss, they were real. But instead of being crushed by them, he used them as fuel. He became a young man who didn't just endure, he evolved. He learned how to adapt, how to hide his fear, how to lead without asking for praise. He didn't chase pity, he chased purpose. This is the version of Prince Philip the world never really saw. Not the man standing beside a monarch, but the child who had to grow up faster than most. A boy who watched everything stable fall apart and still managed to stand tall. These early years, the pain, the movement, the loss didn't just shape him. They created the foundation of the man who would one day win the heart of a future queen. And as we move into the next part of his journey, that meeting wouldn't be a fairy tale. It would be a collision of two very different worlds, brought together by something much deeper than love. Sometimes history changes in a moment no one notices, not with a crown or a speech, but with a glance across a ballroom. That's exactly how it began in 1934, at a royal wedding few remember today. A teenage naval cadet named Philip, full of energy and sharp wit, walked into the ceremony as just another distant cousin. On the other side of the room stood a quiet, young girl, Princess Elizabeth, watching him from a distance. She was only 8, he was 13. At the time, no one thought anything of it. But something had been set in motion, and 5 years later, it would ignite. In 1939, their paths crossed again, this time at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. Philip had matured into a striking young man, confident and charismatic. He was tasked with escorting Elizabeth and her sister Margaret around the campus. What was supposed to be a formal visit quickly turned into something more personal. Elizabeth, just 13, was captivated. Philip wasn't like the people she'd grown up with. He was bold, alive, a little wild, but deeply intelligent. He challenged the world around him, and without knowing it, he challenged her to see life differently. From that moment forward, they began writing letters. At first, it was light occasional words exchanged between two members of a complicated royal family. But as World War II tore through Europe, their letters became something else, a lifeline. As Philip sailed through dangerous waters in the Navy, Elizabeth waited, reading his words, holding on to them, replying with her own. Their bond grew quietly, away from public eyes, shaped not by fairy tales, but by fear, distance, and the fragile hope that they might survive to see each other again. When the war ended, the world celebrated. But inside Buckingham Palace, questions began to rise. Who was this man that had captured the heart of the future queen? Philip had royal blood, yes, but it wasn't British. He had no fortune, no grand palace, and worse, his sisters were married into German families, a sharp wound. In the aftermath of a brutal war, advisors whispered. Courtiers frowned. The establishment resisted. They said he wasn't polished enough, not proper enough, not royal enough. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She had made her decision. In 1947, the engagement was announced. It wasn't just a love story, it was a statement. Britain, still broken and bruised from war, needed something to believe in, and their marriage gave it that. It was hope, dressed in white silk and military medals. The ceremony was broadcast across the world. People didn't just watch a wedding, they watched the beginning of a new era. A young woman stepping into her own destiny, and a man ready to walk beside her, even if the road ahead would never truly belong to him. But that road wasn't paved with romance alone. It carried the weight of history, the burden of monarchy, and the quiet tension between personal dreams and royal duty. What came next would test everything they thought they knew about love, because in the palace, love alone was never enough. Marriage, for most people, is a private journey. But for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, it was anything but. From the moment they said "I do," their relationship stopped being solely theirs. It became part of Britain's identity, watched, judged, and quietly picked apart by a nation that expected perfection. But inside the palace walls, the truth was far more complicated. Because behind the titles, behind the carefully posed photographs, they were still two very different people, each adjusting to roles they hadn't fully chosen. And for Philip, the transition wasn't just difficult, it was suffocating. He had spent his early years defying odds, creating his own identity out of nothing. But now, married to the future Queen of England, he found himself boxed in by rules older than either of them. He was a naval officer, a leader by nature. But suddenly, he couldn't speak freely, couldn't act independently. He wasn't just a husband, he was a consort. And that came with one unspoken expectation: walk 2 steps behind. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal. A quiet reminder that this was her world now, not his. He tried to find purpose within the boundaries. He took on duties, traveled, shook hands, smiled for cameras. But it wasn't enough. Philip wanted to do more, to lead, to modernize, to leave his own mark. Yet the royal machinery didn't want reform. It wanted tradition. And tradition didn't know where to place a man like him. That tension didn't explode. It built slowly, day by day, year by year, until even the smallest things became battlegrounds. One of the most bitter fights wasn't public. It was about a name. When Elizabeth became queen, the question arose: what name would the royal house carry now? Philip, proud of his Mountbatten roots, assumed the family would take his name, as most families did. But he was wrong. The Queen's advisors, under pressure from the government and her grandmother, Queen Mary, insisted on preserving the House of Windsor. Philip's surname was shut out. "I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba," he once said. "I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." That one sentence revealed a pain he rarely showed, feeling sidelined in the very family he helped build. Then came the moment everything changed. King George VI died in 1952, and Elizabeth became queen at just 25. The crown, once distant, was now a daily weight. Her time was no longer her own, and as the nation turned its eyes to her, Philip watched her vanish behind the duties of state. Their marriage, once a young couple's quiet escape, became a partnership soaked in protocol. He supported her every step of the way, stood beside her through speeches, ceremonies, and Commonwealth tours. But each act of loyalty came with a private cost. He never walked away. He never let his resentment show in public. But make no mistake, he felt it. The loss of freedom. The loss of identity. And yet, despite all of it, he remained steady. Because somewhere beneath the pressure and disappointment, Philip still believed in the woman he married. He understood what she carried. And he knew the world wasn't going to make it easier for her, but even strong foundations can crack under weight. And as they settled into this new reality, a different storm began to swirl, this time not inside the palace, but outside of it. Whispers, rumors, quiet stories that threatened to pull apart what they had worked so hard to keep intact. They had weathered early challenges in silence, held together by duty and a promise to serve something bigger than themselves. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. The whispers started quietly, like a rumor slipping through the walls of Buckingham Palace. And then, without warning, they exploded. Allegations. Headlines. All eyes turned to Prince Philip, and not with admiration. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, stories of alleged affairs began to swirl around him like smoke. Names were dropped, including a famous Russian ballerina. The press didn't need proof. The mystery was enough. In a world still recovering from war, with a queen who never faltered, these stories struck like lightning sharp, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. But Philip never addressed them. He didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He simply carried on, walking beside the Queen as though nothing had changed. And perhaps, in their eyes, nothing had. For Elizabeth, the pain was more complex. She had lived her life under a microscope, every move examined, every word judged. But this was personal. And yet, true to form, she said nothing. Not a single public word. She never defended, never accused. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power. It was control. She stood as she always had, calm and composed, letting the storm pass around her rather than through her. But silence comes at a cost. It protects the institution, but it bruises the heart. Still, they made a choice. Instead of retreating, they stepped forward together. Appearances were maintained, events attended, smiles offered like armor. Their public unity became a quiet statement. We will not be broken. Whatever had happened or hadn't was irrelevant to the image the monarchy needed to uphold. And so, the illusion held. The cracks were invisible to those who didn't know where to look. But behind the veil of formality, questions lingered. Had the pressure of royal life driven Philip toward the edges? Or were the stories just that stories? Those closest to them rarely spoke, but when they did, their words hinted at a deeper understanding. This wasn't a marriage of fairy tales. It was one built on resilience, not romance. Commitment, not comfort. It had endured more than most ever would. Not because it was perfect, but because both of them had made the decision to stand their ground even in the darkest moments. The Queen held to her role with quiet strength. Philip, despite everything, remained by her side. Whatever was said in the corridors or scribbled in the tabloids, one truth stayed constant. They had survived. Not untouched, not unshaken, but unbroken. And that resilience became its own kind of legacy. Yet even the strongest alliances require space to breathe. And as time moved forward, something else began to change slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The bond remained, but the need for distance began to take shape. Because even the most loyal hearts sometimes long for quiet, and soon, that quiet would come calling for Prince Philip. He had given more than 70 years of his life to the crown. He had stood through wars, walked behind thrones, and faced a nation's endless gaze. But in 2017, at the age of 96, Philip did something that stunned even those closest to him. He stepped away. No fanfare, no final speech, just a quiet decision that echoed louder than words. He retired from public life and chose to disappear into the quiet corners of the Sandringham estate. And there, tucked away from the rituals and routines of monarchy, he found his own kind of freedom at Wood Farm. It was not a palace. It didn't gleam with gold or echo with centuries of protocol. It was modest, unassuming, and deeply personal. For a man who had spent his entire adult life under the weight of tradition, this small countryside retreat offered something far greater than luxury. It offered peace. Philip had never truly fit into the stiff mold the monarchy expected of him. He had played the part. He had done his duty. But in truth, he had always craved something simpler. At Wood Farm, there were no ceremonial uniforms, no red carpets, no royal photographers lurking around every turn. There was just fresh air, his books, his paintings, and long walks in silence. Princess Anne spoke about it years later, not with sadness, but with clarity. She said it wasn't about running away. It was about balance. Her father had lived a life of service. Now, he wanted a life of stillness. And surprisingly, Queen Elizabeth understood. Though they would no longer live under the same roof, their bond never broke. It didn't need daily dinners or palace formality to survive. It was built on something far deeper respect. She stayed in London, tied to the demands of the crown. He stayed in Norfolk, tied to nothing but himself. Some whispered that the separation hinted at hidden tension. Others speculated about old wounds and emotional distance. But those closest to them knew better. This was a quiet agreement between two people who had learned, over decades, what it meant to serve and what it meant to let go. Philip wasn't stepping back from Elizabeth. He was stepping into the only chapter of life he had ever chosen entirely for himself. And even in that space, she honored it. Wood Farm became more than a home. It was a final sanctuary, a place where Philip could strip away the titles, the cameras, the endless bowing and clapping, and return to something real. He wrote. He read. He fixed things with his hands. He spoke less and listened more. And in that silence, he found a truth that had always eluded him in the grand halls of the palace. He was enough, just as he was. But the story wasn't over. Because sometimes, life has one more turn, one more moment that no one expects. And in just a few years, something would happen that would pull him and the Queen back together, not in duty, but in something far more intimate. As the world began to shut down, the couple who had spent years apart would find themselves side by side once again this time, not as monarch and consort, but as husband and wife, facing the end, together. As the world was thrown into chaos in early 2020, the gates of Windsor Castle closed. For most, it was just another royal lockdown, another layer of precaution during a global crisis. But for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, it was something far more personal. After years of living apart, each in their own carefully chosen corner of life, they were back under the same roof. Not for duty, not for ceremony, but because the world outside had stopped. And in that rare pause, they chose to face the unknown, together, not as queen and consort, just as Elizabeth and Philip. In those quiet days behind thick stone walls, the noise of royal life fell away. There were no banquets, no handshakes, no speeches, just two people in the twilight of their lives, rediscovering what it meant to simply be together. They shared meals, they read, they sat in silence, comfortable in a stillness few could understand. After 7 decades of public life, this was the chapter they had never expected, one free of pressure, surrounded by stillness, where memories mattered more than headlines. Their children noticed the change immediately. Princess Anne spoke later of how the closeness between her parents deepened during that time. The routines were simple breakfast at the same table, evening walks through the gardens, quiet conversations that carried more weight than years of state visits ever could. After a lifetime of moving in parallel, they were finally allowed to pause, to look back, not with regret, but with a kind of reverence for all they had endured. The trials, the distance, the duty, and the love that, through it all, never broke. But time is never still, and in April 2021, the silence that had once brought peace delivered something else: finality. Prince Philip, at 99, passed away quietly at Windsor Castle. There were no dramatic last words, no grand spectacle, just the end of a life lived fully, stubbornly, and with unwavering loyalty to the woman he had stood beside for most of a century. The Queen, in her grief, didn't waver. She didn't collapse under the weight of loss. But when she spoke, her words were unlike any she had offered before. She called him her strength, her stay, her anchor in every storm. And in that tribute, something shifted in the public's understanding. This wasn't just a royal partnership. It was a love story, shaped by sacrifice and forged through fire. It had known both distance and devotion, both silence and survival. For 73 years, they hadn't just played roles, they had held each other up through history itself. And in their final season together, stripped of everything but time, they proved something deeper. That the strongest kind of love isn't the loudest, it's the one that endures. Yet even in loss, the story wasn't over. Because in the days that followed, Princess Anne, his daughter, his mirror in temperament, finally opened the door to a truth long kept quiet. Her revelations would peel back the royal curtain and reveal what Philip had truly felt in those final years. Not regret, but resolve. Not escape, but a final gift of space. A space that honored the woman he loved and the life they had shared. For most of her life, Princess Anne was known as the no-nonsense royal practical, private, unshaken by the chaos of cameras or headlines. But when she finally opened up about her father, the world paused to listen. Because through her eyes, Prince Philip became more than a title. He became a man who had carried the weight of royal expectation without ever surrendering who he was. And as she spoke, the image of the stern Duke of Edinburgh softened into something far more intimate, more relatable, and more human than the world had ever been allowed to see. Anne described her father as fiercely independent, someone who craved space to breathe, to think, to be. Royal life, by its very nature, offered none of that. It was a theater of constant appearances, rehearsed lines, and a schedule designed not for comfort, but for symbolism. Yet Philip had adapted grudgingly, yes, but he had never abandoned the core of who he was. That stubborn edge, that sharp wit, that refusal to become a hollow figurehead. They were not flaws. They were his survival tools. And in the quiet corners of his later years, they became his truth. Anne understood that better than anyone. She saw how her father wrestled with the tension between public service and personal peace. He was proud of his role, deeply so, but he was never at ease with being ornamental. He needed action, purpose, movement. That's why, she said, his final retreat wasn't sad, it was sacred. Wood Farm wasn't a withdrawal from duty. It was a return to self. A quiet rebellion against a life that had never been entirely his. And the Queen, with all her grace and steel, respected that choice not just as a sovereign, but as his partner. Their relationship, Anne revealed, wasn't one of constant affection or grand romantic gestures. It was built on trust, on understanding, when to lean in and when to step back. The Queen knew when to let him go, and Philip knew when to return. That dance, that rhythm, became their silent language. A bond forged not in comfort, but in compromise. They were not perfect, but they were steady. And in a world obsessed with image, that steadiness was rare. Anne's words pulled back the velvet curtain and reminded us that even inside the palace walls, love is complicated. That duty, no matter how noble, can strain even the strongest bonds. And that sometimes the greatest form of love is allowing someone to be themselves even when the world expects something else. Her father, she said, was never just the Queen's shadow. He was her equal, her challenger, her anchor in a storm few could survive. And as we reflect on this journey, on the love, the struggle, the sacrifice, we are left with something deeper than admiration. We're left with questions about what we expect from those in power, about what we sacrifice for legacy, and about what truly endures when everything else fades. So now, we turn to you. What are your thoughts on the extraordinary bond between Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth? Was it duty that held them together, or something even stronger? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.